When you think of Henry VIII's children, you probably picture the ruthless Bloody Mary, or the glorious Elizabeth I, but there was another child one, whose brief reign would reveal a darkness that even his notorious father might have found disturbing. Edward VI, the boy king who inherited the throne at 9 years old, would transform from a seemingly innocent child into one of England's most authoritarian rulers before meeting an end so twisted that it would haunt the Tudor dynasty forever. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a sick boy dying young. It's about how absolute power corrupts absolutely, even in the hands of a child. What you'll discover about Edward's final days will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Tudor legacy. The year was 1537, and Henry VIII finally had what he desperately craved, a legitimate male heir. Edward's birth was celebrated across England as the answer to decades of dynastic uncertainty, but his arrival came at a terrible cost. His mother, Jane Seymour, died just 12 days after giving birth, leaving the infant prince motherless and making him even more precious to his increasingly paranoid father. From his earliest days, Edward was treated not as a child, but as England's future salvation, surrounded by guards, tutors, and courtiers who reminded him constantly of his divine destiny. This isolation from normal childhood experiences would prove to be the first step in creating a monster. Unlike his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had both experienced their father's wrath and rejection, Edward knew only praise and adoration. Henry VIII, perhaps feeling guilty about his treatment of his daughters, showered his son with attention and affection that bordered on worship. The young prince was given the finest tutors money could buy, but these weren't ordinary teachers. They were radical Protestant theologians chosen specifically to mold Edward into the perfect Protestant king. From the age of 6, Edward was studying not just Latin and Greek, but detailed theological treatises about the evils of Catholicism and the divine right of Protestant monarchs to rule absolutely. The education that Henry VIII arranged for his son was more like indoctrination than learning. Edward's primary tutor, John Sheik, was a brilliant scholar, but also a religious extremist who filled the boy's head with visions of England as a new Jerusalem, purified of Catholic corruption. Every lesson, whether in history, philosophy, or statecraft, was filtered through this lens of Protestant supremacy and royal absolutism. By the time Edward was 8 years old, he could recite complex theological arguments for why Catholics deserved death, and why any opposition to his future rule would be tantamount to opposing God himself. What made Edward's upbringing particularly dangerous was how it combined intellectual sophistication with complete emotional isolation. While he could debate theology with university professors, he had never played with other children or experienced normal human relationships. His only companions were adults who treated him with reverence, creating a boy who understood complex political theory but had no grasp of human empathy or the value of individual life. This toxic combination of supreme intelligence and emotional stunting would define every aspect of his future reign, turning the cherished heir into a figure of quiet, burgeoning terror. In the autumn of 1547, England found itself ruled by a 9-year-old boy who had been raised to believe he was God's chosen instrument on earth. Edward VI ascended to the throne following his father Henry VIII's death, inheriting not just a crown but a kingdom torn apart by religious upheaval. The young king had been molded by the most radical Protestant tutors his father could find, men who filled his head with visions of religious purity and absolute authority. Unlike his older sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had experienced their father's wrath firsthand, Edward had been sheltered, praised, and told from birth that he was destined for greatness. This combination of divine authority and childish petulance would prove deadly for thousands of his subjects. The England that Edward inherited was a powder keg of religious tension. His father had broken with Rome and established the Church of England, but the country remained deeply divided between Catholics, moderate Protestants, and radical reformers. Edward's Regency Council, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, initially seemed to promise moderate governance. However, the young king had his own ideas about how England should be ruled. From his very first council meetings, Edward demonstrated an unsettling combination of childish petulance and cold calculation, interrupting experienced advisers to lecture them about Protestant doctrine. What struck contemporary observers was how quickly the 9-year-old king began asserting his authority. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward was personally reviewing death sentences and showing a disturbing enthusiasm for the executions of those he deemed heretical. Court records from this period reveal a child who treated matters of life and death like intellectual exercises, debating the theological justifications for various punishments with the same detachment he might discuss Latin grammar. Witnesses reported that Edward would often smile when signing death warrants, apparently pleased with his own cleverness in finding scriptural justification for each execution. The boy king's early months were marked by what courtiers privately called religious tantrums, explosive fits of rage whenever anyone suggested moderation in religious policy. Edward had absorbed his tutor's lessons so completely that he genuinely believed any compromise with Catholic practices was a personal betrayal of Christ. When an advisor suggested allowing some Catholic nobles to continue private worship, Edward reportedly threw his inkwell at the man and screamed that God would punish England for such weakness. These incidents were initially dismissed as childish behavior, but they actually revealed the forming of a genuinely dangerous religious fanatic. Perhaps most disturbing was Edward's apparent lack of normal childish interests. While other 9-year-olds played with toys, Edward spent his free time reading accounts of the Spanish Inquisition and taking detailed notes on interrogation techniques. His personal servants reported finding drawings in his chamber depicting various torture methods, annotated with Edward's commentary on their effectiveness for extracting confessions from heretics. The boy who should have been learning to ride horses was instead studying the most efficient ways to break human bodies and spirits in service of his Protestant vision. This cold, academic fascination with cruelty was a chilling portent of the reign to come, a clear sign that the intellectual prodigy was also a budding moral monster. What made Edward particularly dangerous was his combination of religious fanaticism and royal authority. While his advisors plotted and schemed around him, the boy king absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with terrifying enthusiasm. He kept detailed journals of his reign, and these documents reveal a child who delighted in descriptions of executions, religious persecutions, and the suffering of those he deemed heretics. By age 10, Edward was personally composing sermons that were delivered in churches across England, sermons that called for the complete elimination of Catholic influence and promised divine punishment for anyone who showed mercy to heretics. The young king's cruelty wasn't limited to religious matters. Edward demonstrated a vindictive streak that shocked even hardened courtiers who had served his ruthless father. When servants displeased him, Edward would devise elaborate punishments that seemed designed more to humiliate than to correct behavior. One unfortunate page who spilled wine on Edward's papers was forced to stand in the courtyard for hours while courtiers threw rotten food at him, all at the specific direction of the 11-year-old king. Edward watched these humiliations with obvious pleasure, often taking notes on the victims' reactions, as if conducting scientific experiments. The boy king's journal entries from this period reveal a mind that was becoming increasingly detached from normal human emotion. Edward wrote about the sufferings of others with the same clinical detachment he used to describe the weather, noting details of pain and fear as interesting observations rather than tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being flogged on Edward's orders for allegedly practicing Catholic prayers, the young king's only recorded comment was to note that the correction proved more effective than anticipated in removing the subject from further error. This chillingly bureaucratic language, applied to a human life he had just extinguished, showcases a mind already well on its way to sociopathy. His intellectual development was far outpacing his moral development, creating a dangerous imbalance that would have catastrophic consequences for his kingdom. The boy was a machine of logic and theology, utterly devoid of the empathy that forms the bedrock of humane governance. Edward's treatment of his own family provided perhaps the clearest indication of his growing sociopathy. Despite being raised alongside his sisters during early childhood, Edward showed no natural affection for Mary or Elizabeth once he assumed the throne. Instead, he viewed them through the same cold religious lens he applied to all his subjects. Mary was a dangerous Catholic who needed to be controlled or eliminated, while Elizabeth was a potential ally whose Protestant sympathies made her marginally more acceptable. Family relationships for Edward were purely political calculations, devoid of any genuine warmth or emotional connection. The transformation became even more apparent when Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, attempted to gain influence over him through gifts and flattery. Rather than being swayed by kindness, Edward saw Thomas's overtures as attempts to manipulate him and responded with cold calculation. When Thomas was arrested on charges of treason, Edward not only supported his execution, but purportedly watched from his window as the man, who had once been kind to him, was dragged to the scaffold. Witnesses reported that the boy king showed no emotion as the axe fell, instead making notes in his journal about the effectiveness of different execution methods. As Edward entered his 12th year, his authoritarian tendencies intensified dramatically. The boy who had once seemed frail and bookish began asserting direct control over government policy, often overruling his advisors when he felt they were being too lenient. His Protestant reforms became increasingly draconian, with mandatory church attendance enforced by networks of informants and severe penalties for any deviation from approved doctrine. Edward personally designed a system of religious surveillance that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud, with neighbors encouraged to spy on neighbors and children, rewarded for reporting their parents' religious transgressions. The king's obsession with control extended to every aspect of English religious life. He issued detailed regulations governing not just public worship, but private devotions, dictating exactly how his subjects should pray, what they should believe, and even how they should think about God. Violation of these regulations was treated as treason against both crown and deity, with punishments that escalated from public humiliation to imprisonment to death. The boy king personally reviewed every case, often increasing the recommended punishments because he felt the original sentences showed insufficient zeal for Protestant purity. The machinery of state terror was now fully in the hands of a child who wielded it, with intellectual glee and a complete absence of compassion. Edward established what were essentially thought police, encouraging subjects to report on their neighbors' religious practices with rewards for successful denunciations. The young king took personal pleasure in reading these reports, often summoning the accusers to court to provide additional details about their neighbors' supposed transgressions. Those found guilty of Catholic sympathies faced imprisonment, torture, or death, with the young king personally reviewing and often increasing the recommended punishments. Edward's court became a place where paranoia and fanaticism were rewarded, and mercy was seen as weakness. The machinery of persecution that Edward created was remarkable for its systematic nature and the king's personal involvement in its operation. Unlike adult rulers who might delegate such matters to subordinates, Edward insisted on reviewing every case personally, studying the details of each accused person as alleged crimes, and often devising specific punishments tailored to what he saw as their particular theological errors. His journals from this period read like manuals for religious persecution, filled with detailed discussions of which punishments were most effective for different types of heresy. What made Edward's persecution particularly chilling was how he combined childish creativity with deadly serious intent. When traditional punishments seemed insufficient, the teenage king would invent new forms of humiliation and suffering, always justified by elaborate theological arguments. One Catholic priest who refused to renounce his faith was forced to carry a sign, reading "Enemy of Christ" through the streets of London, while children threw stones at him, all at Edward's specific direction. The king watched this spectacle from his palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's suffering while dictating observations to his secretary. This fusion of intellectual justification and sadistic pleasure marked him as a uniquely dangerous kind of tyrant, one who believed his cruelty was not only necessary, but divinely sanctioned. His reign was transforming England into a laboratory for his own twisted experiments in social and religious engineering, with his subjects as the unwilling test subjects in his quest for a perfect and perfectly merciless Protestant state. The king's obsession with religious purity extended to his own family in ways that revealed his complete lack of natural affection. Edward viewed his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, not as family, but as the greatest threat to his Protestant England. In private letters that survived, Edward wrote about Mary with a hatred that was both childish and chilling, referring to her as the bastard and Christ's enemy, while plotting ways to have her declared illegitimate or even executed for heresy. The boy who should have felt brotherly affection instead harbored fantasies of seeing his sister burn at the stake for her religious beliefs. Edward's hatred of Mary went beyond mere political calculation. It seemed to consume him with a personal intensity that worried even his most radical advisers. The young king spent hours devising scenarios where he could legally eliminate Mary from the succession, consulting with Protestant lawyers who were all too willing to find legal justifications for what amounted to fratricide. Court observers noted that Edward's mood would darken whenever Mary's name was mentioned, and he would often retreat to his chambers to write long screeds about the theological necessity of removing her from the line of succession. The boy king's plans for dealing with Mary became increasingly elaborate and cruel. Edward drafted detailed scenarios for Mary's arrest, trial, and execution, complete with specific charges of heresy and treason. He even wrote what he intended to be Mary's confession, forcing her to renounce Catholicism and acknowledge her illegitimate birth before being granted the mercy of a quick death by beheading rather than burning. These documents, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a mind that had moved far beyond normal political rivalry into genuine sociopathic hatred. Edward's treatment of Elizabeth was more complex, but equally disturbing. While he approved of her Protestant beliefs, he viewed his younger sister primarily as a useful tool for his religious agenda rather than as family. Edward planned to use Elizabeth's eventual marriage as a way to cement Protestant alliances, treating her future happiness as irrelevant compared to the political advantages her marriage might bring to his cause. Even his relatively positive feelings toward Elizabeth were filtered through his religious obsessions, making it clear that his sister's value to him was purely instrumental. The king's inability to form normal family relationships extended to his broader court as well. Edward treated his nobles, advisers, and servants not as individuals with their own worth, but as pieces on a chessboard, to be moved according to his religious and political strategies. Those who served him faithfully for years could find themselves discarded or even executed if they showed insufficient enthusiasm for his increasingly extreme policies. Loyalty to Edward meant complete submission to his vision of Protestant England, with no room for personal conscience or moral qualms. When Edward began showing signs of serious illness in early 1553, his behavior became even more erratic and cruel. Rather than softening in the face of mortality, the 15-year-old king became obsessed with ensuring that his Protestant reforms would survive his death. He knew that Mary's accession would mean the restoration of Catholicism, and this knowledge drove him to increasingly desperate measures. The possibility of his life's work being undone by his Catholic sister filled Edward with a rage that bordered on madness, leading him to contemplate solutions that would have horrified even his tyrannical father. The young king's declining health seemed to intensify, rather than moderate, his extremism. As Edward grew weaker physically, His religious fervor burned even brighter, as if he were trying to compress a lifetime of Protestant purification into his remaining months. Court physicians reported that the king's illness was accompanied by periods of fevered preaching, during which he would deliver rambling sermons about the need to eliminate Catholic influence, even if it meant killing every Catholic in England. These rants were initially dismissed as delirium, but Edward's lucid moments revealed that his extreme statements reflected genuine intentions rather than sickness-induced ravings. Edward began secretly meeting with Protestant extremists, plotting a coup that would bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. A conspiracy that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty, involving plans to arrest or kill both of his sisters and install a puppet regime controlled by Protestant fanatics. The 15-year-old king, despite his physical weakness, threw himself into these planning sessions with an energy that amazed and frightened his co-conspirators. The details of Edward's final plot revealed the full extent of his transformation from innocent child to would-be tyrant. Working with John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, Edward crafted a plan that would have resulted in the deaths of both his sisters and the installation of a Protestant regime more extreme than anything England had ever seen. The conspiracy included provisions for mass executions of Catholic nobles, the seizure of all Catholic properties, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every aspect of English life. Edward's personal involvement in planning these atrocities was both detailed and enthusiastic. The dying king spent his final weeks drafting lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be seized, and laws to be enacted in his Protestant paradise. His handwriting, increasingly shaky due to his illness, filled page after page with plans for what amounted to religious genocide. The boy who had once seemed like an innocent victim of political manipulation revealed himself to be the driving force behind a conspiracy that would have made the Spanish Inquisition look merciful by comparison. But Edward's illness had a cruel twist that seemed almost like divine retribution for his planned atrocities. Modern medical analysis suggests that the young king suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and what was likely arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by his own physicians in a misguided attempt to treat his condition. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The king who had poisoned England with religious hatred was himself being slowly poisoned by the very people trying to save his life. As the poison slowly destroyed his body, Edward experienced hallucinations and periods of madness that were interpreted by his courtiers as religious visions. The boy who had shown no mercy to others spent his final weeks in agony, his body racked with pain as he slowly wasted away. Court physicians noted that Edward's suffering seemed to intensify his religious fervor rather than providing any spiritual comfort, as if his physical torment was feeding his mental obsessions rather than purifying them. The manner of Edward's death was particularly horrifying for those who witnessed it. Court physicians recorded that the young king's body began to emit a foul odor weeks before his death, and his skin took on a greenish tint that suggested severe poisoning. Edward's hair and fingernails began falling out, and he suffered from violent convulsions that left him temporarily paralyzed. The boy who had once been considered one of the most beautiful of Henry VIII's children became a grotesque shadow of his former self, his body seemingly rebelling against the poison that was killing him. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the king remained lucid enough to understand what was happening to him, spending his final days alternating between screams of physical agony and fevered rants about Protestant martyrs. Edward's last coherent conversations were not about reconciliation or forgiveness, but about his regret that he wouldn't live to complete his planned purification of England. The dying king begged his conspirators to proceed with their plot even without him, promising them that God would reward their faithfulness in establishing his Protestant paradise. The young king's final hours were a grotesque parody of a deathbed scene. Instead of seeking forgiveness or expressing love for his family, Edward spent his last breath cursing his Catholic sister and praying for God to preserve Protestant England from what he called Mary's wickedness. Witnesses reported that his final words were not of peace but of hatred, a fitting end to a life that had been consumed by religious fanaticism and political extremism. When Edward finally died on July 6, 1553, the relief among his courtiers was palpable, though few dared express it openly. The boy king who had promised to be England's salvation had instead become its nightmare, and his death offered the only escape from increasingly extreme policies that were driving the kingdom toward civil war. Even his most devoted supporters privately acknowledged that Edward's death might have been a mercy for England, though they would never have admitted such thoughts publicly. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed how completely his carefully laid plans had been built on the foundation of his personal authority. Without the king's driving will behind the conspiracy, it collapsed within days, as moderate Protestants abandoned what they now recognized as an extremist plot. Lady Jane Grey, the intended beneficiary of Edward's coup, found herself virtually friendless, as nobles who had seemed committed to the Protestant cause suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. Mary's successful claim to the throne was supported not just by Catholics, but by moderate Protestants who were horrified by what Edward's reign had revealed about the potential for religious extremism. The boy king who had dreamed of becoming England's greatest Protestant champion had instead ensured that his reign would be remembered primarily for its cruelty and the relief that followed his death. Even committed Protestants found themselves welcoming the Catholic Mary as a preferable alternative to the continued rule of Protestant extremists. The irony of Edward's story extends far beyond his failed succession plans. The young king who had been so obsessed with eliminating Catholic influence actually strengthened it through his extremism. His persecution of moderate voices within the Protestant movement had left English Protestantism dominated by fanatics who repelled ordinary believers rather than attracting them. By the time of his death, many English Protestants were beginning to view Catholicism as a refuge from the increasingly harsh demands of Edward's version of reform religion. Modern historians have begun to reevaluate Edward VI's reign, and the picture that emerges is far darker than the traditional narrative of a sickly boy manipulated by ambitious advisors. Court records and private correspondence reveal a young man who was genuinely enthusiastic about persecution and showed disturbing signs of enjoying others' suffering. Edward's personal involvement in planning executions and his detailed journals documenting torture methods suggest that England was ruled for 6 years by what can only be described as a child psychopath with unlimited power. The transformation of Edward from innocent child to cruel tyrant offers disturbing insights into the corrupting nature of absolute power. Unlike adult rulers who might at least retain some capacity for empathy or political calculation, Edward's complete isolation from normal human relationships and his total belief in his own divine authority created a perfect storm of cruelty. The boy who had never been told no and who believed that opposition to his will was literally sinful became capable of atrocities that shocked even the violent Tudor age. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward's courtiers were increasingly frightened by their young king's behavior, but felt powerless to restrain him. The same divine right doctrine that justified his rule also made any opposition to his will tantamount to blasphemy, leaving even his closest advisors unable to moderate his increasingly extreme policies. The boy king had created a system where his slightest whim became law, and his growing taste for cruelty had no check except death itself. Perhaps most chilling of all is the question of what might have happened if Edward had lived to reach full adulthood. His plans for Protestant England included the establishment of a permanent religious police force, the complete elimination of Catholic nobility, and the creation of a surveillance state that would have monitored every aspect of his subjects' private lives. The teenager who died in 1553 had already begun implementing these policies on a small scale, and there is every reason to believe that a mature Edward VI would have created one of history's most oppressive regimes. The legacy of Edward VI serves as a reminder that evil can emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that good intentions can be corrupted by unlimited power and religious fanaticism. The boy king who believed he was saving England's soul nearly destroyed its body, and his death may have been the greatest mercy his reign could have offered his subjects. His story stands as a warning about the dangers of combining absolute authority with ideological certainty, especially in the hands of someone too young to understand the full consequences of their actions. Edward's story also illuminates the dangerous intersection of youth, power, and ideology. While adult tyrants might be restrained by political calculation or personal relationships, Edward's complete isolation and absolute belief in his own righteousness made him capable of contemplating atrocities that even hardened political operators found shocking. The child who should have been playing with toys was instead planning mass executions and religious purges, treating human lives as expendable resources in his quest for religious purity. The boy king's reign also demonstrates how education can become indoctrination when it lacks balance and human perspective. Edward's tutors had created a brilliant theological scholar, but a moral monster, someone who could construct elaborate intellectual justifications for cruelty, but who had never learned basic human empathy. His story serves as a warning about the dangers of any educational system that prioritizes ideological purity over human decency. In the end, Edward VI's brief reign stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of power corrupting innocence. The boy who began as Henry VIII's cherished heir ended as a figure so frightening that his own death was celebrated by his subjects. His transformation from protected child to would-be tyrant reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the particular dangers posed by those who believe their cruelty serves a higher purpose. The death of Edward VI marked not just the end of a life, but the end of what might have been England's darkest possible future. The boy king's final agony, racked with pain and consumed with hatred for his own family, serves as a fitting conclusion to a reign that had promised so much hope but delivered only fear. In dying young, Edward VI may have inadvertently performed his greatest service to the England he claimed to love, sparing it from the full flowering of his terrible vision. His tale is a chilling testament to the idea that the most dangerous monsters are not always the ones who are born in darkness, but sometimes the ones who are raised in a light so blinding it scorches their humanity, leaving only a hollowed-out vessel for ideology and hate. The court that Edward created was a reflection of his own warped psychology. It was a place where intellectual brilliance was prized, but emotional intelligence was a liability. Courtiers learned quickly that the path to favor was not through wise counsel or moderation, but through an enthusiastic embrace of the king's radical religious agenda. Men who could quote scripture to justify a brutal policy were rewarded, while those who spoke of mercy or caution were sidelined or, worse, accused of harboring Catholic sympathies themselves. This created a toxic feedback loop where the king's extremism was constantly reinforced by a circle of advisors who were either true believers or cynical opportunists. The atmosphere was one of stifling paranoia. With the king actively encouraging his subjects to spy on one another, no one could feel safe. A private prayer, a chance remark, the ownership of a forbidden religious icon, any of these could be reported to the authorities, leading to investigation, imprisonment, and death. This culture of fear atomized society, breaking down the bonds of trust between neighbors, friends, and even family members. It was a perfect system of control, one that isolated individuals and made them entirely dependent on the will of the state, which was, in turn, the will of a teenage boy. The very architecture of his reign was designed to remake England in his own image, logical, rigid, and utterly devoid of compassion. His reforms were not just about changing how people worshipped, they were about changing how they thought. The destruction of religious imagery, the smashing of stained glass windows, The whitewashing of church frescoes, the melting down of gold and silver chalices, was a physical manifestation of his desire to erase the past. It was an attempt to wipe the cultural and spiritual slate clean, to create a New England that owed its existence solely to his Protestant vision. This was not reform. It was a cultural revolution, driven by the uncompromising zeal of a young man who had never been taught the value of what he was destroying. His reign stands as a chilling example of what happens when a brilliant but undeveloped mind is given absolute power over a nation, says Soule. The psychological portrait of Edward that emerges from his own journals is one of profound and disturbing narcissism. He writes of himself and his reign in the third person, creating a strange detachment from his own actions. He chronicles executions, rebellions, and personal tragedies with the same dispassionate tone he uses to record the weather. There is a complete absence of introspection, of doubt, of any sense of the human cost of his policies. His journal is the record of a boy playing a game of statcraft, a game where the pieces are human lives and the rules are derived from his own interpretation of divine will. This narcissism was nurtured by his upbringing. Having never been contradicted, having been told from birth that he was God's chosen vessel, he developed a messiah complex of staggering proportions. He genuinely believed that his vision for England was God's vision, and therefore, any opposition to him was opposition to God. This belief gave him a terrifying moral certainty. It allowed him to justify any cruelty, any persecution, as a necessary step in the purification of his kingdom. He was not a tyrant in his own eyes. He was a saint, a holy warrior waging a righteous war against the forces of darkness. This self-perception is what made him so uniquely dangerous. A cynical tyrant might be swayed by pragmatism or self-preservation. But Edward, the true believer, was unburdened by such considerations. His cruelty was not a means to an end. It was a sacred duty. This is why his reaction to his own impending death was not one of fear or a desire for reconciliation, but one of rage and frustration that he would not have time to complete his holy work. He saw his own death not as a personal tragedy, but as a potential catastrophe for God's plan in England. His final act, the conspiracy to disinherit his own sisters, was in his mind a last, desperate attempt to save his nation's soul from the damnation he believed Mary's reign would bring. It was the ultimate act of a narcissist who cannot conceive of a world that does not conform to his own, while a final futile attempt to impose his own fanatical vision on the future even from beyond the grave. It is a sobering exercise to compare Edward to his two infamous sisters. Mary the First, Bloody Mary, is remembered for her brutal persecution of Protestants, the Smithfield fires becoming the enduring symbol of her reign. Elizabeth the First, for all her Golden Age glory, was a ruthless ruler who executed her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, and presided over a state that brutally suppressed Catholic dissent. Yet, there is a crucial difference. Both Mary and Elizabeth came to the throne as adults, their characters forged by years of hardship, betrayal, and political uncertainty. They had been declared bastards, they had feared for their lives, and they understood the precarious nature of power. Their cruelty, while real, was often tempered by political calculation and a deep understanding of the world they inhabited. Edward, in contrast, knew none of this. He came to power as a coddled, adored, and isolated child. He had never known hardship, never had his authority questioned. His cruelty was not born of political necessity, but of an abstract, theoretical, and fanatical ideology that had been poured into him like poison. While Mary and Elizabeth were often forced to be ruthless to survive, Edward seemed to genuinely enjoy the intellectual and theological exercise of persecution. He lacked the humanizing experience of suffering that might have tempered his extremism. This makes the question of his potential future even more terrifying. A mature Edward would not have been a pragmatic Elizabeth, or even a brutally reactionary Mary. He would have been something else entirely, a ruler who combined the intellectual rigor of a theologian with the moral emptiness of a sociopath and the absolute power of a king. He would have had the intelligence to build a truly totalitarian state and the religious conviction to believe it was a paradise. England, under a mature Edward VI, might have become a Protestant North Korea, a hermit kingdom of ideological purity, policed by a network of spies and ruled by a king who saw every act of state terror as a prayer. The chilling irony is that the premature death of Henry VIII longed for son. The event that seemed like a national tragedy was almost certainly England's salvation. It saved the nation from the full, terrifying flowering of the boy, King's dark and holy vision. The physical reality of Edward's final illness provides a grotesque and fitting metaphor for his reign. His body, once celebrated as the beautiful, perfect vessel for the Tudor succession, became a site of horrifying decay, its putrefaction mirroring the moral and political sickness he had inflicted on his kingdom. The contemporary descriptions of his death are a catalogue of Gothic horror. The foul smell that emanated from him was so powerful that it was said to cling to the clothes of his attendants for hours. This was not just the smell of sickness. It was the stench of corruption, a physical manifestation of the poison within. The greenish tint of his skin, the loss of his hair and nails, these were the outward signs of a body at war with itself, a system collapsing from the inside out. This physical decay can be read as a powerful symbol. The boy who sought to purify his kingdom was himself made physically impure. The king who showed no mercy was subjected to a slow, merciless death. The ruler who delighted in the suffering of heretics was made to suffer an agony that horrified all who witnessed it. There is a sense of cosmic, biblical justice to it, a theme that would not have been lost on the deeply religious minds of the 16th century. The possibility of arsenic poisoning, even if administered with therapeutic intent, adds another layer of profound irony. The boy who had been so carefully protected from all harm, the most precious political asset in Europe, may have been killed by the very people tasked with preserving him. This speaks to the limitations of human power and knowledge in the face of biological reality. The physicians, with their primitive and often dangerous remedies, were as much a threat to the king as any assassin. It's a chilling reminder that in an age of faith and superstition, even a king was not safe from the well-intentioned ignorance of his own servants. The most haunting aspect of his death, however, is the persistence of his lucid, cruel intellect amidst the ruin of his body. Even as his flesh was failing, his mind remained sharp, focused on his plans for persecution and political revenge. He was not humbled by his suffering. He was not softened by the approach of death. Instead, his physical agony seemed to fuel his mental fanaticism, as if the pain was a crucible that burned away any last vestiges of compassion or doubt. His deathbed was not a place of repentance, but a command center for a conspiracy. His final breaths used to curse his enemies and pray for the success of his hateful plans. It was the end of a monster, not of a martyr. A failure of Edward as device for the succession is a testament to the limitations of absolute power when it collides with the entrenched traditions and political realities of a kingdom. Edward, in his isolated, theoretical world, believed he could simply rewrite the laws of inheritance with a stroke of his pen. He assumed that his divine authority, combined with the power of his Protestant allies, would be enough to impose his will on the nation. He failed to understand the deep-seated English belief in legitimate, hereditary succession. He also underestimated the personal loyalty and sympathy that many, even Protestants, felt for his sister Mary, who was seen as a woman grievously wronged by their father. The Duke of Northumberland, Edward's chief foe conspirator, was a skilled political operator, but was also widely distrusted and hated by the nobility. His attempt to place his own daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne was seen by many not as a principled stand for Protestantism, but as a naked, cynical power grab. When Edward died, the personal authority and religious zeal that had been the engine of the conspiracy died with him. The nobles who had reluctantly supported the plan, fearing the wrath of the living king, quickly abandoned it in the face of overwhelming public support for Mary. The English people, given a choice between a usurper backed by a clique of unpopular extremists and the legitimate, if Catholic heir, chose legitimacy. The speed with which the coup collapsed was stunning. Lady Jane Grey's reign lasted only 9 days. Support for Mary swelled, and she entered London not as a conqueror, but as a popular queen, welcomed by cheering crowds. The men who had tried to steal her crown were arrested, and the Protestant extremists who had surrounded Edward were scattered. The entire edifice of Edward's final fanatical plan crumbled to dust. This outcome is the ultimate bitter irony of his reign. In his desperate, cruel attempt to save Protestantism, he created a political and popular backlash so severe that it guaranteed the accession of a devout and reactionary Catholic queen. His extremism did not secure his legacy. It ensured its destruction. He had wanted the England's Josiah, the biblical boy king who purified his nation. Instead, his actions paved the way for a Catholic restoration and the very persecutions he had spent his life trying to inflict on others. His legacy was not one of purification, but of chaos, division, and a spectacular self-inflicted failure. Modern scholarship has been slow to dismantle the myth of Edward VI as the pious, innocent victim, but the evidence from his own writings and the records of his court paint an undeniable portrait of a budding tyrant. The traditional historical narrative often frames him as a puppet, manipulated by ambitious older men like his uncles, Edward and Thomas Seymour, and later, John Dudley. While he was certainly influenced by his advisors, especially in his early years, this view fundamentally misunderstands his character. The records show a boy who was not a passive recipient of instruction, but an active, enthusiastic, and often leading participant in the radicalism of his own reign. His journal is not the work of a puppet. It is the work of a precocious, intelligent, and chillingly self-assured young man who believed utterly in his own authority and judgment. The level of detail in his writings about military tactics, theological disputes, and legal punishments reveals a mind that was deeply engaged with the business of power. He was not just signing documents placed before him, he was drafting them. He was not just observing his counsel, he was lecturing it. The psychological analysis of Edward suggests a personality marked by a dangerous combination of high intelligence, low empathy, and extreme narcissism, all nurtured in the incubator of an isolated and adoring court. He was a prodigy, but a prodigy of a terrifying kind. His ability to master complex theology gave him the tools to justify his own cruelty in the most sophisticated terms. He could rationalize any act of persecution with a quote from Scripture, any act of tyranny with an appeal to his own divine right. This made him far more dangerous than a simple, brutish tyrant. He was a tyrant with a clean conscience, a monster who believed he was a saint. The question of what might have been had he lived remains one of the most chilling counterfactuals in English history. Had he survived his illness and reached adulthood, there is little doubt that his reign would have become one of the most oppressive in European history. The surveillance state he was building would have been perfected. The religious persecution would have intensified, and his plans to extend his absolute authority over every aspect of his subjects' lives would have been fully realized. England, under a King Edward in his 30s, might have been a dark, grim, and terrifying place, a society where intellectual dissent was impossible, and religious deviation was a death sentence. In this light, his early death ceases to be a tragedy and becomes a form of deliverance for the nation he ruled. It was a brutal and agonizing end for a young man, but it may have saved England from a far greater and more prolonged agony. The legacy of Edward's reign is a complex and cautionary tale. In the short term, his extreme Protestantism provoked a powerful Catholic reaction under his sister, Mary. The Marian persecutions, while driven by Mary's own fervent faith, were also a direct response to the aggressive, uncompromising reforms of Edward's government. In a very real sense, the fires of Smithfield were kindled during Edward's reign. However, in the longer term, the seeds planted by Edward's reformers did take root. The Book of Common Prayer, first introduced under Edward, would, in a modified form, become the enduring foundation of the Anglican Church under his sister Elizabeth. The theological groundwork laid during his 6-year reign, for all its brutality, fundamentally altered the religious landscape of England and set the stage for the Elizabethan settlement. But this political and religious legacy cannot be separated from the human cost of his reign. His story is a powerful warning about the dangers of ideological certainty, especially when it is combined with absolute power. Edward and his advisers were so convinced of the righteousness of their cause that they believed any means were justified to achieve their ends. They saw mercy as weakness, compromise as betrayal, and human suffering as an unfortunate but necessary byproduct of their holy mission. This is the timeless pathology of the fanatic, a mindset that has been responsible for some of the greatest atrocities in human history. Edward's story is particularly disturbing because it shows this pathology developing in a child, a mind that should have been filled with curiosity and play, but was instead filled with theological dogma and a chilling appetite for persecution. The tale of the Boy King is not just a piece of Tudor history. It is a universal parable. It speaks to the corrupting nature of power, the danger of raising children in isolation from the real world, and the terrifying potential of a brilliant mind untethered from a compassionate heart. It reminds us that the capacity for great cruelty does not always come in the form of a raging, obvious monster. Sometimes it comes in the guise of a quiet, studious, and pious boy who, in his quest to create a paradise on earth, is willing to unleash a living hell. The chilling death of Henry VIII's only son was not the end of an innocent, but the timely abortion of a tyranny. The contrast between the public image of Edward and his private reality is central to understanding his reign. To the outside world, and in the official propaganda of his government, he was presented as a new Josiah, the virtuous boy king from the Old Testament who would cleanse his nation of idolatry and restore true worship. Portraits depicted him as a serious, learned, and pious youth, the hope of a new Protestant England. This was a powerful and effective piece of branding, designed to inspire confidence in a kingdom ruled by a child. He was the symbol of a break from the past, a departure from the perceived corruption of the old Catholic world, and even the excesses of his own father, Ezrain. This narrative of the godly imp was embraced by Protestant reformers across Europe, who saw Edward's England as a beacon of hope, a potential leader of an international Protestant alliance. But behind this carefully constructed facade was the boy revealed in the private records of the court, and in his own journal, a boy who was cold, vindictive, and increasingly fascinated by the mechanics of cruelty. The public saw the pious scholar. The court saw the religious tantrums. The public read the eloquent, ghost-written sermons delivered in his name. His advisers felt the sting of his sharp, intolerant rebukes. The public saw the hope of a new, enlightened age. His servants saw a boy who devised humiliating punishments for minor infractions and watched the suffering of others with a disturbing, clinical detachment. This duality is the key to his psychological makeup. He was living a life of profound internal contradiction, a life where his public role as a Protestant saint gave him license for his private sins of cruelty and pride. He was able to reconcile his actions with his faith because he had been taught that he, as king, was the ultimate arbiter of what was right and holy. His will and God's will were one and the same. This is why a modern diagnosis of a personality disorder, like malignant narcissism, is so compelling. It helps to explain how he could be simultaneously so intellectually developed and so morally stunted, so outwardly pious and so inwardly cruel. The myth of the godly boy king was not just a piece of public propaganda. It was a delusion he almost certainly believed about himself, a delusion that enabled and justified his worst impulses. The story of his reign is the story of this myth slowly and terrifyingly becoming a reality. As the boy grew into the role of the absolute, merciless ruler he had been trained to be. The final chilling irony of Edward's story is how his obsession with purity religious, political, and dynastic was mirrored in the grotesque impurity of his death. He spent his life trying to cleanse his kingdom, to create a perfect, orderly Protestant state, free from the corruption of Catholicism. Yet his own body became a vessel of profound and uncontrollable corruption, its decay a foul and public spectacle. He who had demanded that his subjects' souls be pure found that he could not command the purity of his own flesh. This symbolic resonance is inescapable. The body that was meant to be the future of the Tudor dynasty, the guarantor of a pure line of succession, became a rotting, stinking testament to the failure of that very idea. His physical agony was a brutal material counterpoint to the abstract theological world he inhabited. He could debate the nature of the Eucharist with the most learned men in Europe, but he could not stop the agonizing putrefaction of his own legs. He could design a system to police the thoughts of his subjects, but he could not silence the screams of his own pain. This confrontation with the raw, uncontrollable reality of his own body seems to have had no humbling effect on him whatsoever. If anything, it made him retreat further into the certainties of his ideology. As his physical world collapsed into a chaos of pain and decay, he clung ever more tightly to his vision of a perfectly ordered, purified kingdom. His last political acts were not attempts to heal the divisions he had created, but to deepen them, to make them permanent. The ultimate legacy he left behind was not the Protestant paradise he envisioned, but a kingdom more divided, more traumatized, and more unstable than he had found it. His reign was a brief, violent fever, and his death, while horrifying, was the moment the fever finally broke, allowing the kingdom to begin the slow and painful process of recovery. In the end, we are left with the image of a boy who was both a victim and a monster. He was a victim of a system that placed him in a position of absolute power long before he was equipped to handle it. A victim of an education that was a form of brainwashing, and a victim of his own tragic, painful illness. But he was also a monster of his own making, a boy who embraced the worst aspects of his power with enthusiasm, and who, in his quest for a twisted kind of perfection, was willing to sacrifice his family, his subjects, and the peace of his own kingdom. The story of Edward VI is a dark jewel in the Tudor crown, a tale of innocence lost and cruelty found. A chilling reminder that the path to hell can be paved not just with good intentions, but with the unwavering righteous certainty of a boy who believed he was a king, a prophet, and a god.